Hello, everybody. The other day, I was discussing the Israel-Palestine conflict with a friend of mine, and they sent me this episode of Sam Harris's podcast, episode 351, to try to convince me of the anti-ceasefire position. And to be frank, I found Sam Harris's arguments to be so weak and disgusting that I got angry, and the only productive thing I can do with that anger is to make a video to preach to my small little audience here on YouTube. I don't really have very much time to make a really fancy video with lots of visuals like in the past, but I might add some potentially out of context memes or something. But at any rate, I do want to counter some of the specific claims that he made in his episode of the podcast and give my thoughts on some of the problems in his worldview more broadly. Now, he did release this episode at the end of January, and I don't listen to Sam Harris frequently, so I don't know if he's changed his tune on any of this. Something tells me he hasn't, but as a disclaimer, I am responding to a Sam Harris from a few months ago. So first, I'll talk a little bit about the general perspective that he and presumably a lot of his listeners have. I think the worldview embedded in his brand of new atheism makes him much more inclined to see religion as the problem. So when he looks at an issue like the Israel-Palestine conflict, the sort of facile explanation that the conflict exists because the Palestinians are religious fundamentalists who can't be reasoned with presents itself as a very plausible and intuitive answer. Part of the problem is that he and a lot of other atheists, especially the stereotypical internet new atheist types, have kind of a shallow understanding of what religion actually is, how it functions, and what it can be. And I think that their understanding actually lines up more with like a religious fundamentalist's understanding. That is that a religion is defined entirely by a yes or no checklist of mythological beliefs. So it's this like cut and dry and clear thing, and it can be thought of as this exogenous force independent of history and material conditions that exerts its influence upon the state of affairs. This is in contrast to the view that religions are historical processes whose character is influenced by the context they're embedded in, for example, or the view that they are spiritual traditions that develop over time as they address new problems using a certain conceptual repertoire. Now, I'm sure that Sam Harris knows that religions have changed over time and that they can be influenced by historical accident, but it doesn't seem to be held in mind or be his actual working understanding of religion. As evidence of this, in addition to his very shallow and unhelpful analysis in general, in the episode he calls on Muslims to, quote, moderate their faith so that they can push back against the sort of jihadist strain which is prevalent over much of the Arab world. And that sort of implies that the problem with jihadists is that they are taking their religion too far or taking it too seriously. And I don't know that much about how progressive Muslims engage with and interpret their religion, but I'm pretty sure if I asked one of my Muslim friends about their opinion on Islamic fundamentalists that do honor killings and beat women or whatever, they would probably say that they are a bunch of idiots that don't understand the core tenets of the religion. And this lines up with the fact that terrorism is not actually correlated with an increased level of religious education and is more explained by political discontent. You can read about that in this book called Enough Already by Scott Horton, which I thought was pretty good. It is definitely the case that religious fundamentalism, Muslim and Christian fundamentalism included, does suck. It is part of the problem over there in the Middle East, just like it's part of the problem here in the States. But if Sam Harris and others like him didn't have this shallow understanding of religion, they wouldn't be able to pluck religious fundamentalism out of the current situation without seeing that it is connected to all these other historical things. This would lead them to ask questions about how this particular jihadist fundamentalist strain got so popular in the first place, and how it was able to take root and develop the way that it has. Like, for example, which actors may have seen an opportunity in letting Hamas rise as a counterweight to the secular PLO? The Israeli government actually facilitated the rise of Hamas in an attempt to undermine the PLO. Even I would view this claim with some level of skepticism if it were not for the fact that Israeli officials, Avner Cohen, the official responsible for religious affairs in Gaza, and Brigadier General Yitzhak Segev have admitted to this. It's not like they just, made it from scratch, of course, or astroturfed it or whatever. But I think to say that they facilitated the rise of it is a good way of describing it. You can read about it more on your own. At any rate, though, when you think about it more, it makes sense given that the United States has done similar things. Like, we were funding the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, for example. Another thing that I found really interesting was this quote here.
And I fear this will be forgotten almost immediately, the moment I begin defending Israel, is that there is no ethical or political argument that makes sense of the sight of lifeless children being pulled from rubble. With just a glimpse of the imagery coming out of Gaza, it's only natural to think that any action that could produce such carnage must be evil. It is absolutely natural to feel that since urban warfare guarantees that innocent children will die, violence cannot be the answer. So Israel should just stop fighting. But this is an illusion. However horrific, even unthinkable, sometimes war is necessary.
So he does acknowledge that the suffering of innocents is bad, of course, but he does say that what I think is the voice of your conscience here is an illusion. I find that really interesting because religious fundamentalists have their own way of doing the same thing. They'll say instead that, you should ignore your conscience because it is not actually your conscience but an illusion from the devil, and you should trust God. In other words, them instead. And what this shows is that you have views about religion and a worldview with its interrelated set of concepts on the one hand, and the way you engage with it and use it on the other. And that's not to say that ideas or religious beliefs or lack thereof are totally epiphenomenal, but that the picture is more complicated, and there's a lot going on subconsciously that we're not aware of. So for some stereotypical Reddit atheist who says, we could just solve all the problems in the world if we just threw religion in the garbage, or conversely, for some fundamentalist who says the inverse, we have our counter-argument right here. At any rate, let's get into some of the more specific claims that he makes and rebut those. But first, one of the things that I want to point out more generally is that he doesn't really seem to be able to properly represent the other side of the argument, and you should take that as a serious red flag. After listening to this podcast, I personally became convinced that Sam Harris should not be taken seriously as a public intellectual. And I'm not just saying that because I disagree with him. I definitely have very strong opinions and I like to say stuff, but I do try to see the nuances and hold in mind that, sometimes smart people can see things differently. And if you want evidence of that, you can go watch my video on abortion, where it would have been very easy for me to just be a mindless pro-choice cheerleader. And even though I am very firmly pro-choice, I acknowledged the moral complexity of the situation in a way that I think most other people in my position would not. So I really don't think that I'm the kind of person who just calls people stupid because I disagree with them. But that's for you to decide. So one of the first claims that I will refute is actually before he enumerates any of these so-called myths. He says against the idea of a ceasefire that pacifism only works against a sane enemy. And he argues that jihadists are exceptionally problematic to fight against because they are indoctrinated with this sort of martyrdom mindset, so that they basically want death, and that this makes them uniquely dangerous in a way that even Nazis are not. The problem with using this as an argument against a ceasefire is that, firstly, it's creating a false dichotomy. And this is the first time of many where he's not really representing the counter-argument very well. So, for example, you could take a more bellicose stance than mine and say that certain military actions are a good idea, but that Israel has crossed the line in a number of ways, that they need to do a better job at providing humanitarian aid, and that Netanyahu is an extremist who is not the right guy for the job. But even when talking about the pacifist stance, I feel like Sam Harris makes it sound like the pacifist approach is just about asking Hamas nicely, please stop. And that kind of oversimplification is a way of sidestepping real difficult conversations about the roots of the conflict and the ways in which Israel is violent, such as with settlement expansion in the West Bank and so forth. To ignore that is not only immoral in my view, but also woefully impractical. Sam Harris argues that Muslim culture is exceptionally problematic because it gives a theological grounding for the martyrdom mindset that jihadists have. And I certainly do not like religious fundamentalism of any kind. But just go look up on Wikipedia suicide attacks, and you'll see that it is not uniquely a Muslim phenomenon. So to whatever extent religious fundamentalism is part of the issue, and it certainly doesn't help, Sam Harris is sidestepping conversations about why the religious fundamentalism of that kind has gotten particularly popular to begin with. So what Sam Harris lists as the first myth is the idea that Israel is conducting a genocide against the Palestinians. He argues that this is nonsense because firstly, the population has grown. There were some 250,000 Palestinians in 1948, and now there are over 2 million. And he also says that if Israel had wanted to, they could have killed every single Palestinian. And since they haven't done that, they must not have wanted to. And so, therefore, the killing of civilians that we see today is best explained by Israel having to deal with things like human shielding and Hamas and the difficulties of urban warfare and such. So these are just really bad arguments. The fact that their population has grown since 1948 until the last census does not mean that atrocities have not happened. And whatever you think about the project of the Israeli state since 1948, whether or not the Israeli state could be accused of genocide before its response to October 7th is a different question from whether we can consider their response to October 7th to be a genocide. We won't know the details until the dust settles, but it's looking pretty ugly. There's a horrible civilian death toll, and there are mass graves, people are going hungry, and that's going to show up in the population numbers later. But even when talking about before October 7th, the kind of arguments that I remember seeing were more like that the Israeli state is involved in slowly pushing out and choking out the Palestinian people by dispossessing them from their land and undermining their basic political rights in a way that would prepare the Israeli state for the kind of atrocities that we're seeing now. And that checks out. The fact that the population has grown does not mean that injustices didn't happen or that innocent people weren't killed, nor does it mean that Israel hasn't pushed Palestinians off their land, nor does it mean that Israel hasn't undermined the establishment of a Palestinian state and violated their basic political rights. Now, let's look at the second argument he makes, where he says, the Israeli state could kill them all if they wanted to, but they haven't, so they must not want to. Look, they've been providing aid, and they've even stayed their hands in this or that situation. How bad can they be? This was never a very good argument, but it's even harder to make now with a straight face, since things are getting so grim. But to the extent that the carnage hasn't been even worse than it already has been, altruism is not needed to explain that. I shouldn't have to explain this to anyone, but I guess I do. But getting caught doing a genocide is not good for the one doing it. It is in the Israeli state's self-interest to maintain some sense of plausible deniability. Even with the level of carnage that they have wrought now, there's already a lot of political pressure within the country that is their biggest ally and weapon supplier to stop shipments of arms. And domestically, there's pressure on Netanyahu to take a more diplomatic route in order to actually get the hostages back. If the Israeli state lost their plausible deniability, the backlash, both domestically and abroad, would undermine their project. But I must add that the plausible deniability is really starting to wear thin at this point. Another reason that I think the Israeli government is conducting a genocide is that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that could be plucked if they were interested in minimizing harm to innocent people. They would be providing a sufficient amount of aid instead of starving these poor folks out. They wouldn't be bombing aid workers from organizations who coordinate their movements with them. And the United States wouldn't have to work around Netanyahu to attempt to deliver humanitarian assistance. I'm not saying I would be okay with this, but I would feel very different if they were very harsh in their military campaign, but they really tried to ensure that everyone got access to medical care and had food, water, and dignified living accommodations. And they wouldn't have to foot the bill for that. They could just let external charity organizations do their work and let the United States provide that aid. But they aren't doing that. They were cutting off some 70% of the trucks and killing aid workers. And they released these false accusations that UNWRA was staffed by Hamas terrorists that resulted in multiple countries, including the United States and Great Britain, cutting their funding to the organization. The second myth that Sam Harris brings up is the idea that, according to international law, the Israeli response needs to be proportional, but according to him, the word is being misused to suggest that the damage inflicted by Israel needs to be in equal measure to the damage inflicted by Hamas. Instead, proportional means that it simply asks that we weigh the military importance of an action against the resulting destruction of civilian life and property. If Sam Harris's point sounds reasonable here, that's because he's boxing against phantoms. I haven't seen anyone base their argument on the first sense of the term. There is something to be said about respecting the first sense of proportionality in the context of limiting escalation in a conflict, and some people will bring up these kinds of raw damage comparisons in order to illustrate which side comparatively has more power or to make some other kind of point. But ceasefire supporters have absolutely been making their arguments with respect to the second correct definition of proportionality. Bombing a refugee camp because you believe that there's a Hamas commander there, raiding a hospital without evidence that it is a command center, and bombing aid workers you were coordinating with because you think a militant may have been with them absolutely constitute violations of proportionality according to the second sense of the term. Sam Harris lists as the third myth the idea that the Jewish people are colonizers. He argues instead that there has been a continuous presence of Jewish people in the land for thousands of years and that they are therefore indigenous. He then goes on to point out that other countries have done far worse than Israel has, and all this focus on Israel is a sign of corruption in the UN. He even goes on to mention the now debunked story that the United Nations Relief and Works Agency was staffed by Hamas members who participated in October 7th. To be fair, he wouldn't have known it was false at the time, but something tells me that he hasn't let his audience know that the story turned out to be unfounded. Someone correct me if I'm wrong, but that's where I'm placing my bets. But at any rate, Sam Harris is absolutely correct that Jewish people have had a continual presence in the region for the past 2,000 years, and that Jewish people are among the indigenous population. But the indigenous Jewish people were seen as Palestinians and are related to, but are not the exact same group of people as the European Jewish people, who did see themselves as colonizers, including Theodor Herzl, the father of modern political Zionism himself. So I have Scandinavian ancestry, but I can't just set up shop in Denmark and kick someone out of their home. If I and some other like-minded people took land and established an independent state there with the support of the US government, yeah, that would be colonization. So these two claims can be simultaneously true. Some of the indigenous people there are Jewish, yes, and also some Jewish people engaged in colonialism in Palestine. Those are not mutually contradicting statements. Now, when it comes to colonialism and settler colonialism, there are some semantic arguments to be had, but to me, it seems clear that the bottom line is that the political rights of the Palestinian people have not been respected. Under British control, they were not able to set their own immigration policy, and the incoming population pushed them out of their land and wound up establishing an ethno-state on land that had previously belonged to them. And that's kind of the core issue. For the record, my rule of thumb is that if you're born somewhere, you have a right to live there. And so I think that Israeli Jewish people who were born in Israel have a legitimate connection to the land too. I don't want to see anyone getting kicked out. But what I see as problematic is that the political rights of Palestinians have gone unrespected. And until that problem is solved, things will not get better over there, in my view, for anyone. In my opinion, one democratic state with equal rights for all, including the right to return for Palestinians, is the only long-term solution. Understanding this is not just about blaming Israel or whatever. It's about understanding how to provide a long-term, sustainable solution. And to this point, the Palestinians were not so concerned about the immigration of Jewish people before the Balfour Declaration and before they began to perceive it as a project to push them off their land. To be sure, I'm sure that there are a lot of details that can be disputed, and I don't want to act like I know everything about this. But what I can tell you is that Sam Harris's facile reasoning is not enough to, quote, dispel the myth that the Palestinians were colonized. Sam Harris identifies as the fourth myth the idea that the atrocities of Hamas were a legitimate response to oppression. He argues that Israel left Gaza in 2005 and that billions of dollars in international aid have since been spent there. So I wouldn't say that the response was legitimate to the extent that it involved harming innocent Israeli civilians. And of course, most ceasefire supporters would agree with me on that. It is the case that there was a lot of false reporting which exaggerated the barbarity of the Hamas invaders, but even with that acknowledged, Hamas did commit atrocities on October 7th, and I condemn those. What I will say, though, is that the attacks were a response and a product of real oppression, albeit a bad one. When Sam Harris talks about Israel leaving Gaza in 2005, he completely omits the fact that since then, Israel has upheld an air and sea blockade on Gaza, and that Israel controls the water and electricity supply to the region and restricts their freedom of movement. To say the least, looking past the economic implications of all this, the inability to engage in trade and set an industrial policy, this is a direct affront to their national sovereignty and basic political rights. The fact that Sam Harris would leave that out shows that, at a minimum, he is unable to properly represent the other side of the argument. And to be perfectly frank, it makes me question his integrity on the issue. Can he really not have known about that or not thought that it was important context for his listeners? I don't know. Either way, I'm not impressed. But that's not the only important bit of context being left out. People have known that the situation in Gaza was a powder keg for a long time. People were warning about the deteriorating conditions spiraling out of control. The people in Gaza were living in poverty, and nobody talks about the people held without due process in administrative detention and the innocent Palestinians killed leading up to October 7th. To say that their oppression is questionable is very ignorant. In order to start solving a problem, you need to recognize that it exists. So the fact that arguments like the kind Sam Harris is making here have any currency at all indicate that whatever you think about how the Palestinians have historically responded to their situation, Israel is not a partner for peace in this conflict. Sam Harris identifies as the fifth myth the idea that the two sides in this conflict are equally civilized, equally entitled to respect, and equally worth protecting. He does say that when it comes to children, a human life is a human life. But what he's arguing is that Hamas and the cultures that support organizations like it are inferior to Israeli culture and society. Now, I don't like religious fundamentalism either, and I haven't seen anyone argue that it is equally valid as the sort of progressive secular liberalism that Israel claims to embody. But a lot of this stuff that I said earlier at the beginning of this video, particularly surrounding understanding historical context and root causes, applies here, and I will add a couple things. Firstly, while Israeli society is a lot better in a lot of ways vis-a-vis treatment of LGBT people and women, that doesn't mean that they can't have their own pathologies and problems, in particular with respect to how they treat indigenous people. For example, we may like a lot of the ideas and the advancements brought by Europeans during the Enlightenment to political theory and the natural sciences, but they had some horrible ideas about race and used them to commit atrocities during colonization, which I would argue still exists in a masked form today. So there are people who will shout death to Arabs and protest to block humanitarian supplies from getting in. And recently, some Israeli activists blocked Jordanian aid trucks headed to Gaza and destroyed the aid. You know, as someone who spends a lot of time volunteering to get supplies to people who need them, I do, homeless outreach, and I help out with my local mutual aid org at a free store, and I buy people groceries. The idea that there are people who not only are indifferent to the suffering of those around them, but would actually go out of their way to take away food and supplies from those who need them just makes me absolutely sick. This is not some sort of crime committed in a moment of passion, but this is something that they are doing deliberately because their hearts are so hardened. It is vile and repugnant and part of a long list of barbarous actions, including killing and celebrating the death of a peace activist and assaulting the funeral procession of a Palestinian American journalist who was killed by the IDF. Secondly, if you take these values seriously and the idea that a child's life is of equal value regardless of its nationality, then you should criticize the actions of the Israeli state, limiting humanitarian aid, violating international law, both in the way they've conducted their war and their settlement of the West Bank, destroying civilian infrastructure, killing innocent people, intentionally or due to carelessness. These are all things that should be condemned. The point of having the values is that you actually abide by them. So if they want to show how civilized they are, now's their chance. And I gotta tell you, they're not living up to the challenge. So with that, I finished my rant. Thank you everyone who has listened this far. If you like this, please hit like and leave a comment for the algorithm. If I've made any mistakes or if you have any comments, please leave them and I'll try to engage productively as time permits. At any rate, have a great day. This has been a Nerdy Tree production.